Hey guys, tonight we're taking a trip to a time when everything was just a little bit too extra. 1920s Paris. But don't get too excited about flapper dresses and jazz hands. We're talking about the heroin craze that swept through the city like an uninvited guest at a champagne party. Picture it. Paris, 1920. The city of lights, love, and light addiction. Yeah, it's about to get real and real strange. Before we jump in, take a second to like, subscribe, and comment, but only if you actually enjoy what I'm doing here. No pressure. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because honestly, it's always midnight somewhere, right? Now, dim those lights, set a fan to create some soft white noise, and get comfy. Maybe even tuck in your feet so the imaginary rats can't nibble your toes. Let's think about it for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like living in the roaring 20s? You know, beyond the dancing and fancy, cocktails. What was Paris like in its wildest days, before Instagram and TikTok made everything look effortlessly glamorous? Was it all glitz and glam, or were people secretly trying to avoid a very, very bad habit? Could you survive the night without falling into the traps of the social scene? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in Paris, 1925. You're standing at the corner of Rue des Champs-Élysées, looking at a crowd of artists, poets, and addicts, where nothing is quite as it seems. Good luck. It's 1920, and Paris is buzzing, but not in the way you think. The city's most fashionable new accessory? Heroin. It's not just a medical wonder anymore. It's the latest craze for the creative minds, the elite, and anyone looking for an escape. As the streets of Montmartre teem with artists and intellectuals, the question becomes, how did a refined city, known for its love of art and fashion, get tangled up with one of the most dangerous substances of its time? Well, to understand this mess, we have to remember that Paris in the 1920s was a city living on the edge, figuratively and literally. The world had just come out of the First World War, and everyone was still reeling from the horrors. But instead of going to therapy or dealing with their emotions like rational human beings, Parisians decided to distract themselves with everything. The nightlife was alive with jazz, gin-soaked soirees, and intellectual debates that could last well into the morning. And for the creative crowd, heroin wasn't just a high, it was a gateway to inspiration. Because why have a glass of wine with your dinner when you could shoot up and really feel the vibes of your art? Heroin was already popping up in Parisian pharmacies as a cure-all. In those days, it was marketed as a remedy for everything from coughs to anxiety. Imagine that. You're feeling a bit stressed from all the existential musings about life's meaning, and someone hands you a vial of heroin. You just trust that it'll solve your problems. The problem is, no one really saw how fast this miracle drug was spreading through the art and intellectual circles. It was like an art movement, but instead of oils and brushes, people were using needles and syringes. Now, let's talk about these artists, shall we? Some of the most famous names in the Parisian art scene were also regulars at the local opium dens. Picasso? He wasn't just dabbling in cubism, he was dabbling in heroin too. He wasn't the only one. The list of creatives caught up in the addiction craze is long. Poets, musicians, dancers, writers. The cafe terraces were packed not just with patrons drinking coffee and complaining about society, but also with people slipping into the depths of heroin-induced euphoria. And somehow, it was all considered avant-garde. It was like the in crowd was on a constant search for the next high in both their art and their substances. But the really fascinating part, heroin didn't just serve as an escape from the world, it served as a way to experience the world. Ever tried to create a masterpiece while high? Well, it was all the rage in Paris. Some artists believed that the drug heightened their sensitivity to light, sound, and texture. They were convinced that the drug opened up new dimensions of perception, allowing them to connect with their subjects in ways that would otherwise be impossible. And, sure, maybe it worked. For a time. But as anyone with a hobby or a Netflix binge knows, too much of something can ruin it. And when you combine addiction with the pressure of being an artist in Paris, you get one hell of a volatile mix. And of course, the artists weren't the only ones indulging. The wealthy and powerful were doing it too, but they were much better at hiding it. Paris had a secret addiction problem, one that was very much intertwined with its status as the epicenter of culture and creativity. The heroin epidemic wasn't something talked about openly. No one was asking, "Hey, did you take your daily dose today?" It was just whispered about in cafes or the back rooms of exclusive salons. You could be sipping champagne and discussing philosophy with the most influential thinkers of the day, only to find out that the person sitting across from you had a needle under the table. In some ways, Paris had become a playground where creativity and destruction collided. It wasn't just about the art, it was about who could go the furthest in their pursuit of transcendence. For many, the addiction was a part of their identity, part of the romantic notion of being a tortured genius. It was as though the very idea of being a true artist meant walking the line between brilliance and madness, and heroin was the shortcut to get there. So, how did the French capital get so tangled up in a deadly obsession? It's all part of that age-old paradox of art, fame, and excess. Paris was a place where the brightest minds could think outside the box, but at the same time, they were trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. The heroin craze wasn't just about the drug. It was about a culture that celebrated pushing limits, and sometimes a little too much. And for those caught in the haze, Paris was no longer just the city of light. It was a city of blurred lines, where addiction could be disguised as artistic enlightenment. Before the Beat generation could even think about making their mark in history, there was the French counterpart, the Lost Generation. They were the poets, the philosophers, and the painters, but not just any poets. These were the ones who thought the only way to truly experience art was through the haze of opium and heroin. How did the avant-garde of Paris end up in the same sentence as addiction, and did they even care? Well, imagine being in Paris in the 1920s. You're a poet, but not the "I'll write a sonnet for my lover" type. No, you're the type who scribbles down dark, cryptic thoughts that make people think, "Wow, that guy's really feeling something." But here's the catch. You're also deeply invested in something else, something that makes your poetry come to life in a way the average coffee drinker would never understand. Drugs. More specifically, opium and heroin. It's like they had discovered that if you smoked or shot up just the right amount, your art would suddenly take on a certain edge, a darker, more profound dimension. It's like they were trying to experience the world in 3D, while everyone else was stuck in 2D. The Lost Generation was made up of a lot of talented individuals. Some were writing books, others painting, and a few were even trying to change the world with their ideas. But the thing that tied them all together, the need to escape. And nothing says escape like a syringe filled with heroin or a pipe full of opium. After all, if you wanted to find the meaning of life in 1920s Paris, Why not do it while in a blissed-out haze, right? It was like the spiritual equivalent of someone saying, I need to find myself, so I'll head to Bali. Only in Paris it meant heading to an opium den and locking yourself in a room with a bunch of people who get it. But let's get real for a second. These weren't just random artists stumbling onto drugs. No, they were intellectuals, people who saw themselves as part of a cultural revolution. They believed the world was too conventional, too structured. Their big idea? Break down the norms and experience reality in a way no one else could. It wasn't enough to just drink wine at a cafe and talk philosophy. No, that was for amateurs. If you wanted to truly understand the depths of human experience, you had to be willing to take the plunge. And that meant embracing the darker side of existence. And what better way to do that than with a little chemical help? So, how did they manage this balancing act? On one hand, they were hailed as creative geniuses, pushing boundaries with their art. On the other hand, they were also secretly passing around needles and pipes. Think of it as the ultimate paradox. You've got these highbrow intellectuals who were trying to elevate human consciousness. And then there was the very real risk of their habit pulling them under. But it didn't seem to matter to them. For them, art was about feeling, and nothing made them feel more than their next fix. It was almost like they were willing to sacrifice their health for their work, seeing it as a small price to pay for the greatness they believed was within their grasp. If anything, it made them even more popular. There's something about a tortured artist, right? People love a good tragedy. And when people started to notice that these guys were creating works of profound depth while simultaneously unraveling, they were seen as even more brilliant. They weren't just creating art, they were living it. Every single day. There's an allure in that. It's like the rock stars of the 1960s, only this time, instead of guitars and microphones, it was about opium pipes and poetry readings. Their addiction wasn't just personal, it was almost like a badge of honor, signaling to the world that they had seen something deeper than the average person could ever dream of. But of course, this addiction took its toll. Artists who had once been hailed as revolutionary were starting to fade away, their works growing darker, more erratic. The heroin haze that had once inspired them now became a prison. Some found themselves trapped in the cycle of addiction, unable to write, unable to create, or even worse, unable to function. The very thing that had elevated them had now become their biggest obstacle. But did that stop them? Of course not. The more they spiraled, the more the world seemed to marvel at their chaos. For the lost generation, life wasn't about balance, it was about extremes. And that meant constantly walking the fine line between brilliance and madness. And here's the kicker. While they were busy sacrificing their health for their art, the rest of the world was watching and taking notes. The next wave of creatives, the beatniks, would look to these lost souls in Paris and say, we'll do that, but with jazz and free love. It was as if the lost generation had paved the way, showing them how to live a life of chaos and creativity. Only this time, the heroin didn't come quite so readily packaged with artistic rebellion, but they were inspired nonetheless. So, while the lost generation may have been lost in more ways than one, their legacy lived on, whether they were aware of it or not. They were the first to prove that sometimes, in order to truly understand art, you might just have to lose yourself along the way. Imagine trying to create your masterpiece while high as a kite. That was the daily grind for many of Paris's celebrated artists. From Picasso to Modigliani, some of the most famous names in art were also famous for their secretive love affair with heroin. But how did addiction impact the art world? And did it make the masterpieces more masterful? Or was it just a desperate grab for inspiration when the world wouldn't cooperate? Let's paint the scene for you. It's Paris, 1920. The cafes are packed with artists sipping espresso, tossing out theories on modernism, and engaging in existential debates. Outside, the streets are lined with men and women wearing their finest, living life with a flair only Paris could offer. But for some of the city's top artists, the real masterpiece wasn't what they were creating on canvas. It was the high they were chasing. Sure, there's still the act of painting and sculpting, but now there's a little something extra to the whole process. The question is, did heroin really help them create art? Or was it simply another tool in their self-destructive toolkit? Let's take Pablo Picasso, for instance. Now, Picasso wasn't just known for his groundbreaking work in Cubism. He was also known for his dalliances with heroin. How much of that brilliant abstraction came from inspiration, and how much of it came from a syringe? The truth is, Picasso was a man on the edge. His genius was marked by emotional turmoil, and heroin seemed like the perfect companion for a mind that needed constant stimulation. But while it's tempting to say that his addiction fueled his art, the reality is more complicated. Sure, Picasso created some of his most iconic works during these years, but whether the drug contributed to the art or just kept him functioning is up for debate. Was he truly high when he painted Guernica, or was it just a desperate act of creation during a chaotic time? Then there's Amedeo Modigliani, a man whose haunting portraits are instantly recognizable. Modigliani was an artist whose personal life was as tortured as his paintings were beautiful. Heroin was a constant presence in his life, and many believe it played a pivotal role in his artistic expression. His elongated faces and necks, symbols of a fragile beauty, might have been a visual metaphor for his own crumbling health and state of mind. But again, it's hard to say whether his addiction truly made him a better artist, or if it just deepened the emotional intensity of his work. What we know for sure is that heroin played a significant role in Modigliani's life, and, tragically, in his early death. He died at just 35, leaving behind a legacy of art that would only be fully appreciated posthumously. Was his brilliance, much like Picasso's, a product of desperation? Or was it the drug that fueled the fire of his genius? And don't even get me started on Jean Cocteau, poet, playwright and filmmaker whose works are now immortalized in the world of avant-garde art. Cocteau had a similar relationship with heroin, using it not just as a way to cope with the pressures of his own mental health, but as a way to unlock a new level of creativity. Cocteau's works were already strange, bizarre, and abstract. But it seems that when the muse wasn't cooperating, heroin was his backup plan. And it was a hell of a backup plan. He could go from writing poetry to creating visual art to directing surrealist films, all while high. But was his drug use just a crutch, or did it enable him to push boundaries further than most? It's hard to say for sure, but Cocteau certainly isn't the only one who blurred the line between artistic genius and self-destruction. The truth is, heroin didn't just impact the artists themselves, it changed how the world viewed their work. There's something compelling about the idea of tortured genius, right? It's the myth that we've attached to many great artists throughout history. By incorporating their addictions into the narrative of their work, we've given their art an almost mythical quality, as though the struggle for greatness can only come at the cost of sanity, health, or in this case, life itself. But while some artists may have genuinely believed that the drug helped them create, the reality is that the high didn't make them any more of a genius. just made them more unpredictable. Heroin, after all, wasn't a tool for artistic genius. It was a tool for survival. For many of these artists, their addiction was as much about escape as it was about inspiration. It was a way to cope with the weight of their own creativity, the pressure to constantly produce, and the existential dread of knowing they had to outdo themselves with each new piece. The heroin didn't give them better ideas. It just gave them a way to push through the pain of trying to have ideas in the first place. In the end, heroin may have shaped the art of the 1920s in subtle ways, but it didn't make the artists themselves any more immortal. The art was timeless because it was brilliant, not because it was created under the influence. These masterpieces have survived long after the needles were put down and the art world moved on. And maybe that's the real testament to their genius, creating something lasting when the world and their minds were in chaos. The Parisian Café Society, a place where philosophers, writers, and thinkers congregated over coffee, croissants, and the occasional shot of heroin. This was no ordinary intellectual scene. Instead of discussing metaphysics and existentialism, they were whispering about their latest fix. So, what did the big thinkers of Paris do when they couldn't think straight anymore? Apparently, they kept on writing, at least until the addiction caught up with them. Now, let's set the scene. Picture yourself in one of the famed cafes of Paris, the kind with old-world charm, marble tables, and the steady hum of conversation filling the air. It's not just any cafe. It's where the greatest minds of the time come to hash out the big questions of life. Sartre? He's probably there. Simone de Beauvoir? You can bet she's sipping an espresso, already deep into her latest philosophical debate. But wait, what's that? Among the passionate arguments about free will and the nature of existence, there's a hissing sound coming from under the table. One of the intellectuals, let's call him Pierre, is discreetly rolling up his sleeve, preparing to inject some heroin before returning to his thoughts on being. Heroin, of course, wasn't on anyone's intellectual agenda, at least not at first. When it entered the scene, it wasn't being passed around as a tool to enhance creativity, nor was it regarded as a cure-all like it was in the medical community. No, the intellectuals of Paris had already mastered the art of thinking. But when the pressure of their philosophical musings became too much, heroin became the escape. It was like their ideas were too grand for their bodies to handle, and so the drug became the quickest solution. Suddenly, every metaphysical musing needed a little more than just coffee to get through. The sharpness of their thoughts became dulled by a haze that didn't seem to stop them, at least not at first. In fact, heroin served the same purpose for these thinkers as it did for their artistic peers. It helped them keep creating. It didn't just block out pain, it also blurred the borders of their consciousness, allowing them to drift in and out of states of transcendence. Ever had that moment when you've been working on something for hours and suddenly it all clicks, everything makes sense? Imagine feeling that all the time, but it's always just a little bit too much. That's the place these intellectuals were living in. Their thoughts became a whirlwind of profound insights, each more layered and intricate than the last, until they couldn't stay grounded anymore. And let's be honest, wasn't that exactly what these intellectuals were after? The world was changing rapidly, and everyone was racing to make sense of it. The First World War had left its scars, and the very fabric of European society was being torn apart. The big thinkers of Paris weren't just sitting in cafes. They were trying to pull the pieces together, creating philosophies that could explain what had happened, what was happening, and, more pressingly, what was going to happen. In a world so full of questions, it's no surprise they'd look for answers in substances that promised an instant way to feel the answers without thinking them through. As the heroin use spread, it didn't just become a casual hobby. It became a ritual, one that followed these intellectuals from cafe to cafe. By the time one of them was deep into an intellectual conversation, they were just as likely to be shooting heroin as discussing the latest paper on existentialism. It wasn't about the drugs in a traditional sense. It was about using them as a mechanism for understanding, feeling the world in a new, enhanced way. Their addiction was not so much about escaping reality, but about heightening it. It wasn't an art form or a fleeting rebellion. It was a means of surviving in a world that demanded they not just think, but think bigger. But as anyone who has ever pushed their limits knows, eventually the high fades and the consequences begin to pile up. The intellectuals may have been able to keep writing through their haze, but their addiction eventually took its toll. They could no longer sustain the pressure of trying to capture the vastness of human existence, while simultaneously battling a drug that was slowly taking over their lives. The heroin that once made their thoughts sharper and more vivid began to dull their minds and, ultimately, their productivity. In some cases, the addiction took a darker turn. Writers who had once been revered for their insights found themselves struggling just to put pen to paper. Philosophers who had once been able to unravel the mysteries of life were now unraveling their own lives. But did they regret it? Did they ever think, maybe I shouldn't have let this drug into my life? Probably not. Many of these thinkers were so entrenched in the myth of the tortured genius that they believed the drug was part of the process, part of what made them real. In fact, some even thought their intellectual rigor required this touch of madness, as though true genius could only emerge from chaos. By the end of it all, Paris's cafe society wasn't just the birthplace of radical new ideas. It had also become a place where the intellectuals had their own dark secret. In between their theories on freedom, the nature of being, and the future of humankind, they were quietly slipping into another kind of existence, one where the drug wasn't just a symptom of the problem, but part of the solution. At least, that's how they saw it, until they couldn't see anything anymore. So, the next time you sip your coffee in a Parisian cafe, or even just at home, just remember, the great thinkers of the past weren't just discussing life and death. Sometimes they were just trying to survive it, with a little help from a shot of heroin and an espresso on the side. Believe it or not, doctors in the 1920s were a bit too comfortable with prescribing heroin. It was marketed as a cure-all for everything from coughs to chronic pain. Doctors didn't know what they were getting into, but society was so obsessed with the drug's supposed magical properties that prescriptions were handed out like candy. But what happened when even the doctors got addicted? To understand how this happened, you have to step into the mindset of early 20th century medicine. This was a time before rigorous clinical trials, before modern drug regulation, and before a full understanding of addiction as a medical condition. Physicians were working with limited tools and enormous pressure. Patients expected relief, and fast. When heroin entered the scene at the turn of the century, it appeared to be exactly what doctors had been waiting for: powerful, effective, and, most importantly, marketed as safe. Originally synthesized in the late 1890s, heroin was promoted as a gentler alternative to morphine. Pharmaceutical companies assured physicians that it was non-addictive and even suitable for children. Medical journals praised its effectiveness. Advertisements framed it as modern and scientific. And doctors, eager to stay on the cutting edge, embraced it without much hesitation. Prescribing heroin wasn't reckless by the standards of the time. It was responsible, progressive, and widely accepted. In Paris during the 1920s, heroin quickly became a staple of legitimate medical practice. Doctors prescribed it for chronic pain, respiratory illnesses like tuberculosis, insomnia, anxiety, and even general fatigue. A patient complaining of stress or nervousness might leave a consultation with a small bottle and instructions to use it daily. Because it came from the physician, the drug carried an aura of trust and legitimacy. If a doctor said it was safe, why question it? But this trust came at a cost. As patients continued taking heroin, tolerance developed. The same dose that once soothed pain or calmed nerves no longer worked, leading doctors to increase prescriptions rather than question the drug itself. Slowly, dependency crept in, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet, normalized routine. Patients weren't seeking thrills, they were following medical advice. Addiction, in many cases, arrived wearing a white coat. The dilemma deepened when physicians themselves became vulnerable. Doctors had easy access to heroin, spent their days surrounded by suffering, and worked punishing hours. Many began using the drug themselves, often starting with small doses to manage stress, fatigue, or pain. In a profession built on authority and composure, admitting dependence was unthinkable. As a result, some physicians continued practicing while quietly struggling with addiction, blurring the line between healer and patient. By the early 1920s, troubling patterns became impossible to ignore. Patients returned again and again for refills, not because their conditions worsened, but because they could not function without the drug. Some showed withdrawal symptoms that doctors did not yet fully understand. Hospitals and clinics began to see the long-term consequences of what had once seemed like a miracle solution. The very medication meant to restore health was now creating a new, widespread problem. Public perception began to shift. What had been framed as modern medicine started to look like dangerous overconfidence. Governments and medical authorities slowly realized that regulation was unavoidable. In France, as in many other countries, stricter controls were introduced in the mid-1920s, limiting heroin prescriptions and redefining its use. But by then, the damage was already done. Addiction had spread far beyond the margins of society, reaching into respectable homes, hospitals, and academic circles. The physician's dilemma of the 1920s was not rooted in cruelty or negligence, but in uncertainty. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping, yet their reliance on incomplete science and persuasive pharmaceutical marketing led to consequences they could not undo. Heroin became a lasting lesson in medical humility, a reminder that innovation without understanding can be just as dangerous as inaction. In the end, this chapter of Parisian history reveals a sobering truth. Even those entrusted with healing are shaped by the limits of their time. The doctors of the 1920s did not intend to create an epidemic, but their confidence in a miracle cure helped fuel one. And once the illusion shattered, both physicians and patients were left to reckon with the cost of believing too easily in something that promised relief, but delivered dependence instead. The Roaring Twenties were a time of great social change. But for some women in Paris, the glamour of the flapper lifestyle came with a dark side. Flappers weren't just dancing and drinking. Many were also toting a secret syringe or two. What was it about the high society of Paris that made heroin seem like a perfectly fashionable companion? And did it affect their relationships, Or was it just another social scene to get lost in? Let's picture the scene. You're in Paris, 1925. The jazz is pumping, the champagne is flowing, and the city is alive with the hustle of the roaring 20s. Flappers, the bold, liberated women of the age, are flaunting their fringe dresses, bobbed hair, and carefree attitudes. The women who embody this new spirit of freedom, dancing, smoking, and talking politics with an audacity that shocks older generations, are, in many ways, the very face of modernity. But behind the glittering eyes and the perfectly painted lips lies a secret. These same women, who seem to have it all, are often holding something far more dangerous than just a cigarette or cocktail. For many, heroin was just another part of the glamorous lifestyle. After all, if you wanted to be part of the in-crowd, it wasn't just about the jazz and the cocktails, it was about what you did after the last dance. Heroin, in the 1920s, was considered sophisticated and even chic in some circles. It wasn't seen as the dangerous and addictive substance that it would later become infamous for. Instead, it was marketed as a cure for everything from pain to insomnia to anxiety. For Parisian women who were expected to juggle their role as both the perfect hostess and an emerging symbol of independence, heroin wasn't just a drug, it was a tool. It helped them cope with the pressures of living up to a newly liberated and glamorous image. It allowed them to keep up with the frenetic pace of Paris nightlife and society gatherings. What better way to calm your nerves after an exhausting day of social obligations than with a little heroin to take the edge off? But there's more to it than just the physical effects. Heroin had become part of the culture in Paris in a way that went beyond medical use. Among the high society, it was intertwined with their need to maintain an image of being above the struggles of the common person. In a society where image was everything, particularly for the women who sought to break free from traditional expectations, using heroin became a way to prove they could push the boundaries without consequence. They weren't just rebels with a cause, they were rebels with the luxury of being able to hide their addictions behind the facade of sophistication and charm. They could attend the most glamorous parties, dance with the most desirable men, and still slip away for a quiet fix, making the drug almost part of their performance. The real question, though, was how it affected their relationships. The flappers' world was one of constant motion, always moving from one party to the next, from one social gathering to the next. In this world, it is easy to lose yourself. Heroin wasn't just something to take at the end of the night. It became a companion to the flapper lifestyle. It gave them that extra edge to keep up with the never-ending whirl of social events. But what did that mean for their emotional connections? The relationships flappers had were often transactional, based on status, appearance, and maintaining a perfect image for the public. Heroin allowed them to play the part even more effortlessly, but it also created an emotional distance. What happens when you can't face the world without a chemical crutch? The answer, unfortunately, is that even the most glamorous parties became hollow, the relationships shallow, and the mask they wore ever heavier. Behind the shimmering pearls and decadent fur coats, these women were often grappling with the tension of their double lives. They lived with a sense of freedom, but also a sense of loss. While they were breaking free from traditional gender roles, they were also falling into a trap of their own making. Addiction crept into their lives quietly, often as a way to cope with the strain of keeping up with the societal expectations of success and liberation. Heroin became a companion they couldn't do without, something that allowed them to keep the act up, but something that also made it harder to really connect with anyone. How could they, when they were losing themselves in the very freedom they had fought for. And let's not forget the men in these women's lives. For many of the intellectuals, artists, and writers who frequented the same parties, heroin was part of the bohemian lifestyle that came with the territory. Flappers weren't just engaging with other women in the scene. They were part of an ever-evolving group that included famous figures who themselves were often battling addiction. These relationships, once seemingly full of promise, were tainted by the influence of heroin. Love, passion, and partnership became just another part of the high, another part of the act to maintain. No one was really looking for emotional depth in a society so determined to perform life. In the end, the flapper's glamour mask, so carefully constructed with makeup, pearls, and elegance, was a fragile thing. Beneath it lay a different story, one where heroin helped hold together the illusion of freedom, beauty, and endless possibility. But in truth, heroin only intensified the hollowness of that glittering world, turning the very symbol of liberation into something that shackled the women it was meant to empower. The Roaring Twenties, with all its vibrancy and vivacity, was also a time when heroin quietly infiltrated the lives of those who had the most to lose, all under the guise of a perfectly fashionable accessory. Jazz and heroin went hand in hand in 1920s Paris, like a smoky bar and a saxophone solo. But how did the most famous jazz musicians of the day find their rhythm when their drug of choice was the very thing that made it hard to keep time? With the intoxicating beat of jazz filling the air, it's hard to imagine a more fitting soundtrack for an era of reckless abandon. But what did it really cost the musicians who helped shape the sound of a generation? Let's start with the scene. Paris, 1920s. The streets are alive with energy. Bars and clubs packed with people wanting to let loose after a brutal war. But what really made the city hum was the sound of jazz. The rhythms, the improvisations, the soul-shaking bass. This wasn't just music. It was freedom wrapped in brass, a fresh sound born from the pain and exuberance of a generation that had seen the world torn apart. And what better place for this music to thrive than in Paris, a city that had long been known for its bohemian lifestyle? But behind the vibrant music and the intoxicating atmosphere, something darker was brewing. For many of the musicians who played these now iconic songs, heroin was just as much a part of the scene as the music itself. Musicians like Sidney Bechet and many others would fill the night air with their brilliant solos, but often they were doing so through a haze of heroin. In fact, it was not uncommon for jazz musicians to use heroin to fuel their creativity. The high gave them a sense of calm and control, a way to tune out the pressures of the world and find that elusive connection with the music. It's almost ironic when you think about it. Jazz is a genre that's built on spontaneity and improvisation, an art form that demands flexibility, quick thinking, and rapid reactions. But heroin, as a drug, does the exact opposite. It slows things down, clouds your thoughts, and dulls your senses. So how does the musician stay in tune with their bandmates when their mind is a little too relaxed? Well, this was the paradox that many of these musicians faced. For some, heroin became a necessary part of the creative process, like a silent partner in the jam session. It helped them feel like they were in the zone, connecting with the music on a deeper level, at least for a while. But of course, the drug wasn't just a source of inspiration. Over time, it became a crutch, a way to cope with the pressures of being a part of the jazz scene. The late night hours, the constant need for new material, the battle with one's inner demons, it was all a lot to handle. And heroin offered an escape, a way to quiet those inner voices that told the musician they weren't good enough, or that they'd never be able to top their last performance. The drug also helped dull the pain of the grueling life that came with being a touring musician in the jazz world. Long hours, poor pay, and a constant cycle of playing the same gigs over and over. Heroin was a way to numb the frustration. But just like jazz itself, the high didn't last forever. Eventually, the addiction began to take its toll. For some musicians, it meant a loss of focus and the inability to keep up with the fast-paced rhythms of the jazz world. The same drug that had once made them feel like geniuses started to strip away their creativity. The music lost its edge. For others, the addiction spiraled even further, impacting their health, their relationships, and their careers. The heroin that had once felt like a source of inspiration eventually became a chain, pulling them away from their art, making it harder and harder to keep up with the demanding schedule of performances, recordings, and endless rehearsals. And then there's the tragic irony. The very thing that shaped the sound of an era, the incredible creativity, the improvisation, the highs and lows of jazz, was fueled in part by a substance that destroyed the very artists who brought it to life. Heroin took away the spark it had helped ignite. For many musicians, their careers were cut short by addiction, leaving behind only their music as a reminder of what might have been. The intoxicating rhythms of jazz became shadowed by the pain of those who played them. But even with all the suffering, jazz still lives on. It outlasted the addiction, the pain, and the struggles of its creators. The music became timeless, not because of the drugs that fueled it, but because of the genius of the musicians who gave it life, even in the darkest moments. And so, the paradox remains. Jazz, a sound born from freedom and rebellion, was also shaped by the quiet whispers of addiction. Yet, despite all that, it stands as a testament to the resilience of creativity and a reminder of the high price that sometimes comes with chasing brilliance. The jazz musicians of the 1920s didn't just create a soundtrack for an era, they created a sound that transcended time. And while heroin may have played a part in shaping that music, it was the spirit of the musicians themselves, their improvisation, their heart, their struggles, that turned it into something immortal. Writers and heroin addicts don't exactly go hand in hand, but in Paris, it was almost the norm. Writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald may have been the glamorous poster children of the lost generation, but their contemporaries were just as lost, if not more so. The most interesting part? Many of these writers found their creativity fueled by their addiction to heroin. But could you write the next great novel while under the haze of a heroin high? For these writers, it seemed to work, at least for a while. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit Parisian apartment, the smell of fresh ink and cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Outside, the city pulses with the rhythmic hum of jazz and conversation, but inside, the world is quiet. The only sound is the scratch of a pen on paper. And as you write, there's a familiar warmth flowing through your veins. It's not just the warmth of inspiration, it's the warm, slow relaxation that heroin provides, coursing through your body and calming your mind. You're not just writing, you're feeling. It's the kind of feeling that makes your words come out in a rush, like they've been trapped inside you for too long, and now they finally have a chance to escape. It's perfect, at least for now. For many writers in 1920s Paris, heroin was not just a form of escape, it was a catalyst for their art. There was something about the haze of the drug that seemed to unlock their creativity. It allowed them to tap into emotions they couldn't access when sober, enabling them to express their deepest thoughts and feelings with more clarity and freedom than they thought possible. But here's the kicker. Many of these same writers, who were praised for their groundbreaking work, were also wrestling with a substance that was slowly eroding their ability to function in the real world. The drug that gave them the courage to write the great American novel or the masterpiece of modern literature also threatened to steal it all away. Take William S. Burroughs, for example. Burroughs wasn't exactly writing cozy stories about Parisian life. His words were sharp, unflinching, and often difficult. Exactly the kind of work that Heroin helped fuel. He wasn't the only one. Other notable authors like John Dos Passos and Thomas Wolfe were part of this scene, where writers spent as much time trying to find their next fix as they did searching for the perfect word to complete their sentences. Their creativity and their addiction were intertwined, forming a relationship that fed both their art and their suffering. But how does a writer keep track of time when their head is in a fog, wrapped in the clouds of a heroin high? It's hard to say. But the thing is, many of these writers didn't see the drug as a hindrance. Instead, they thought of it as a means to unlock the next great wave of ideas. There was a sense of inevitability in their belief that if they could just get to the next fix, they would be able to tap into some deeper understanding of the world. And for a while, it worked. The words flowed, the ideas came quickly, and the creative fire burned bright. Yet, like most good things, this high didn't last forever. Soon enough, the very thing that fueled their work started to gnaw away at their productivity. What began as an intense burst of inspiration soon turned into a cycle of dependence. Writers would find themselves struggling to write, not because they didn't have the ideas, but because their bodies couldn't keep up. The mornings after a long night of writing and using were spent recovering, and more often than not, they were spent staring at the blank page, too strung out to find the words. The rhythm they once had, so effortless, so free, was now a distant memory. At first, the drug was just a secret tool that helped them write their best work. But over time, it became a crutch. They couldn't create without it. And when the addiction became more consuming than the art, the writers found themselves trapped. The heroin was a temporary escape from their personal demons, but it also trapped them in a never-ending cycle. The more they relied on it, the harder it became to function without it. It was no longer just the creative fuel. It was the only fuel. The same substance that had given them their literary voice was now stealing their ability to write at all. Some writers, like Burroughs, managed to break free from the grip of addiction and keep going. Others were less fortunate. Their promising careers were cut short by their dependency, and their most memorable works were either incomplete or marred by the chaos of their personal lives. But even in the haze of addiction, their work lived on. They had captured something raw, something real, a glimpse into the depths of human experience. And that rawness resonated with readers long after the writers were gone. In the end, the relationship between the writers and their addiction is as complex as the art they created. For some, heroin was the key to unlocking their brilliance. For others, it was the price they paid for it. Their lives were a paradox, striving to reach the highest levels of creativity while simultaneously sinking deeper into addiction. They were, in a way, literary escape artists, always running from the reality of their addiction, always searching for the next high to carry them away. But in the end, the real escape came not through the drug, but through the stories they told. Their addiction may have stolen much from them, but it also gave the world some of its most enduring and fascinating literature. Behind every addiction is someone getting paid. In Paris, heroin dealers were just as much a part of the scene as the artists and writers. But these weren't your run-of-the-mill street corner peddlers. No, these were smooth talkers who could convince an artist or intellectual to buy their wares, all while looking like they belonged in the same social circle. The question is, how did they get away with it for so long? Picture this. The jazz bars are packed, the smell of tobacco and whiskey thick in the air, and in the midst of it all, there's the dealer, cool, calm, and undeniably charming. He might wear the same fashionable clothes as the artists, with a knowing smile that says, "I'm not like the others here." His speech is smooth, his demeanor confident, and his connections impeccable. He moves in the same social circles as the most respected figures of the time. You'd never guess that the same person who was discussing the intricacies of French literature over dinner was also the one supplying the very heroin that kept the circle going. These weren't your stereotypical drug dealers. The ones operating in Paris during the 1920s understood the art of fitting in. In a world where reputation and social status were everything, they knew that appearing respectable was just as important as the goods they were selling. So, instead of lurking in the shadows, they blended seamlessly into the sophisticated Parisian nightlife. They frequented the same cafes, rubbed elbows with the intellectuals and artists, and discussed the same works of literature and philosophy that their clients were obsessed with. Their appearances were clean, polished, and they carried themselves like they belonged in the upper echelons of society. This ability to blend into these circles wasn't just about looking the part. It was about speaking the language. They didn't approach the writers and artists with a blunt, "Hey, you want to get high?" Instead, they would craft their pitches with subtlety and sophistication. They might casually drop references to the greats, talking about how an artist's latest work could reach new heights with a little inspiration, or how a writer's best words would come with a bit of release from the pressures of life. The dealers understood the value of language and reputation just as much as any intellectual would. The heroin wasn't the taboo, dirty drug it would become later. To these dealers, it was a tool for elevating the creative process, a product that could be marketed not as an escape, but as an enhancement. And, of course, the most important thing these dealers had was trust. They didn't peddle to just anyone. They knew exactly who to approach. They didn't just deal in drugs, they dealt in ideas. The artists and intellectuals they targeted were often caught in a web of self-doubt, battling the pressure to outdo themselves, to reach that next level of creative brilliance. These dealers weren't just selling heroin, they were selling the illusion of access to genius. To be high was to be inspired. To use heroin wasn't to be weak, it was to be a part of the avant-garde, the misunderstood geniuses pushing the boundaries of their craft. It wasn't a vice, it was a rite of passage. But while the dealers were playing their cards right, the artists and writers were slowly sinking deeper into their dependencies. The tragedy of these smooth-talking dealers was that they were just as good at manipulating the reality of addiction as they were at appearing respectable. Their victims weren't just artists, they were intellectuals, people with the power to shape the world's ideas. But those who were hooked didn't see it that way. They saw the dealers as part of the culture they wanted to be a part of, and in many ways, the dealers were just as talented at weaving themselves into the social fabric as the artists and intellectuals they sold to. They were playing the long game. As the addictions spread through the artistic and intellectual communities of Paris, the question remained, how did these dealers get away with it for so long? In a city that prided itself on intellectual rigor and artistic purity, how could drug dealers be so deeply embedded within such revered circles? The answer lies in the very nature of the addiction. Heroin wasn't just a drug, it was a part of the culture. It wasn't something you talked about openly, but it was something that could be implied, something that could be passed with a nod and a smile, a whispered word in the corner of a room. The dealers knew that in a city built on artifice, on appearances, on the facade of sophistication, they didn't need to hide in the shadows. They could walk right into the heart of the social scene and blend in with everyone else. Their success wasn't just about selling a product. It was about understanding the culture they were in and positioning themselves as part of it. But eventually, the cracks began to show. The artist who once couldn't stop writing was now struggling to even get out of bed. The once vibrant jazz musician couldn't make it through a set without slipping into the fog of withdrawal. The dealers, of course, kept on selling. But with the increase in addiction came the eventual crash, the fallout of an era of artists who were buying into a fantasy of creative brilliance fueled by heroin. And while the dealers may have lived to sell another day, the price for this illusion was paid in the lives and careers of those who believed the myth. In the end, the dealers didn't just sell heroin, they sold a lie, that creativity could be distilled from a drug, and that brilliance could come on demand. For a time, they were right. But like any good illusion, it didn't last forever. It's hard enough to juggle one love affair, but in 1920s, Paris, artists, writers, and musicians found themselves torn between their love of art and their love of heroin. Sometimes it was a dangerous game of keeping both alive. Other times, one simply overshadowed the other. What happens when the creative drive is fueled by something darker than passion? And how did these love triangles play out in the halls of Parisian salons? In the smoky, dimly lit cafes and salons of Paris, where conversation flowed as freely as wine, a different kind of triangle was taking place. One that wasn't about lovers, but about the relentless tug-of-war between a creative passion and a drug that promised an escape from reality. The battle between the artist and their addiction wasn't one they could easily escape. In fact, for many, the heroin wasn't just an escape. It became part of the process. To create, they believed, was to endure suffering. And what better way to survive that suffering than with a little help from a substance that could numb the pain and open their minds to new ideas? Heroin, in a sense, became a silent partner in their artistic pursuits. Like any affair, it started out as something exciting and thrilling, a chance to transcend the ordinary, to push past the boundaries of what the world had come to expect. For writers, it was a key to unlocking words that seemed to evade them in their sober moments. For artists, it allowed them to see the world through new, vibrant lenses. The sense of freedom was intoxicating, but, as with any affair, the lines between love and obsession began to blur. What happens when you mix the passion of an artist with the dulling effects of heroin? You get a strange kind of creativity, one that often seems more like a fleeting illusion than a long-lasting masterpiece. The addiction creeps in, slowly at first, like the first rush of inspiration from a new painting or poem, until it's impossible to tell where the drug ends and the art begins. At first, it feels like the perfect pairing. The artists believe the heroin is the secret ingredient that turns their ordinary works into genius. But soon, it becomes clear. Heroin is not just fueling their creativity, it is slowly replacing it. Many artists found themselves in this tug-of-war, where the craving for the next dose grew stronger than the craving for their work to be seen. The salons and smoky jazz bars of Paris became scenes of not only artistic debate and creative breakthroughs, but also the shifting allegiances between those who wanted to stay sober for their craft and those who simply couldn't. The drug started to overshadow the very thing that made them who they were. In the early days, heroin was part of the creative process, but soon it wasn't about creating anymore. It was about survival. The artist's obsession with heroin began to drown out their need to paint or write, turning what was once a productive obsession into a destructive force. For some, the relationship with the drug was fleeting. They could break free, set their work back into motion, and return to their artistic pursuits. But for others, the love triangle wasn't just a passing phase. It was a lifelong struggle. The creative spirit was constantly at war with the drug that had consumed their body and soul. The question lingered: could art and heroin ever truly coexist? The unfortunate truth was that for many of these artists, heroin didn't make their art better. It simply allowed them to delay facing the hollow reality that was creeping in. Their need for heroin was overshadowing their need to create. In their minds, heroin had become an art. But in Paris, this bizarre relationship wasn't confined to one artist or writer. It was everywhere. It was a social scene, a cultural moment, an era where the dark allure of heroin was interwoven with the world's most creative minds. It was hard to separate one from the other. Could you have the magic of Parisian intellectualism without the haze of heroin? For many, the answer was no. The drug was part of the culture. It was part of what made their lives and their art seem larger than life. The highs and lows of addiction became the backdrop of their work, feeding into their need to constantly reach higher, to constantly push the boundaries of what was possible. But eventually, the artist's relationship with their drug of choice turned into a destructive force. The heroin, once a muse, had become the artist's enemy. It was no longer something they needed to use to create. It was something they needed to use to survive. The price for this addiction? Careers lost to the fog of dependency, masterpieces that never got finished, relationships destroyed in the haze of cravings, and lives cut short by the very thing that was supposed to inspire greatness. The salons, once vibrant with the exchange of ideas and excitement over new works, were now filled with an eerie quiet, interrupted only by the sound of someone stirring their drink, their mind somewhere far away, lost to the drug. And as these creative minds spiraled deeper into the grip of addiction, the love triangle between art, heroin, and the artist became more tragic. For some, the drug was the final step in their process. For others, it was the one thing standing between them and the future they could have had. In the end, the real question wasn't whether heroin could enhance the artist's work. It was whether the artist could ever truly escape the grip of their love for it. And in the salons of Paris, it was clear. For many, heroin had become their one true love. The art, however, was left in the shadows. Paris was known for its late nights, but the addiction to heroin turned the city's reputation for nocturnal energy into something darker. The nights were long, the highs were frequent, and the people who lived through it all found themselves walking the fine line between genius and madness. Could you survive the nights in Paris without falling prey to the allure of the needle? Could anyone? The Parisian night was always a bit of a siren song, a call that promised revelry, adventure, and the romance of the city's streets under the soft glow of gas lamps. The rhythm of the jazz clubs, the murmur of intellectuals debating over absinthe, the soft whispers of lovers sneaking through the alleys, all of it contributed to Paris's reputation as the city that never sleeps, and for good reason. The night was where the magic happened, the place where artists, writers, and musicians could come alive, creating some of the world's most iconic works. But as the 1920s wore on, something shifted in the air. The nightlife didn't just sparkle with artistic inspiration anymore. It was thick with the haze of something darker. The allure of heroin crept into the vibrant world of Parisian nights, transforming them from the late hours of creative indulgence to endless hours of quiet desperation. What had once been a bohemian paradise for those seeking freedom and artistic expression had become a world where heroin's pull was just as strong as the allure of the next jazz beat or the next conversation with a fellow intellectual. Imagine this. You're walking the cobblestone streets of Montmartre, the hum of the city drifting behind you, and the thought of what lies ahead hangs heavy in the air. The temptation to indulge is everywhere. You can feel it in the way people move, the way they talk. The cafe corners and jazz bars are now filled with people who aren't just chasing inspiration. They're chasing oblivion. It's not just about the art anymore. It's about how to feel. And sometimes that feeling is found not in the music or the writing, but in the rush of heroin, the needle pushing through skin in search of a high that promises escape. The dealers, smooth-talking and well-dressed, would blend right in. They understood the game, how to talk, how to sell a dream dressed in the guise of a drug. And they didn't just sell to anyone. They targeted the very people who had the most to lose. The creatives, the thinkers, the people who were expected to produce something extraordinary. For these people, the night no longer just held a promise of inspiration. It held the quiet terror of needing something that heroin could provide to keep the night from crashing down. As the hours ticked by, the city seemed to pulse with a sense of urgency. The world of Parisian nightlife became a tightrope walk between genius and madness, with no real way to know when or if the balance would tip. Musicians, writers, and artists alike pushed themselves to the edge, convinced that they needed the drug to continue their work. But with each high came a low, and with each low came more desperation. The question of whether they could survive the night without the needle became harder to answer. There were those who tried to resist, who insisted that the purity of their craft could not and should not be tainted by the drug. But for many, the pressure of constantly creating, the weight of their own self-doubt, and the fear that they might never reach the next level of brilliance was too much to bear. Heroin promised to release them from those fears, to carry them through the night and into a world where the struggles of reality no longer mattered. It wasn't just a tool for creative inspiration, it was a lifeline. For others, heroin became an intrinsic part of the night's ritual. The lines between the music, the conversations, and the needles began to blur. It wasn't just about feeling good. It was about surviving the pressure, the anxiety, the demands of living in a world that demanded nothing less than brilliance. And as they fell deeper into addiction, the city's vibrant nightlife became a blur of highs and lows, a cycle that only ended when they couldn't keep up any longer. But as these long nights wore on, something changed. What was once an exhilarating dance between art and self-destruction began to show its true cost. The same people who had once created masterpieces were now barely holding on. Musicians who could once play through the night without a thought were now stumbling through their performances, their fingers too slow, their minds too clouded. The great thinkers who had once filled the cafes with ideas now sat in silence, lost to the fog of addiction. The city that never slept had become a place where sleep was the only escape. But in a world of constant highs and lows, even sleep became elusive. The heroin that had once been a temporary release had turned into a permanent crutch, and the artists who had once fueled the city's pulse were now slaves to the very drug that had promised them freedom. So, could you survive the nights in Paris without falling prey to the allure of the needle? Maybe. But only if you had the strength to resist the pull of something that, for many, seemed as necessary as air itself. The artists, musicians, and writers who lived through it all were caught in a world where survival meant not just creating, but fighting for the ability to keep going, to keep breathing in a city that had fallen in love with the very thing that threatened to destroy it. And as Paris drifted from one night to the next, the question remained: how long could the city and its people keep walking the line between genius and madness? The 1920s were fun for Paris, but all good things must come to an end. The heroin craze eventually took its toll, and the effects were devastating. The artists, the writers, the intellectuals, they all had to face the consequences of their actions. What happened when the high wore off? And how did Paris handle the aftermath of its wildest, most decadent era? As the sun began to set on the roaring 20s, the party started to slow down. The jazz bars that once hummed with the infectious energy of a city teeming with creativity were now growing quieter. The music a little more hollow, the laughter a little less spontaneous. The heroin that had once been the secret ingredient in so many masterpieces, the fuel behind the bohemian creativity, began to reveal its darker side. What had started as an artistic escape, a way to transcend the struggles of everyday life, slowly became a trap that many couldn't escape. The price of the high wasn't just steep, it was life-altering. Artists and writers who had once roamed the streets of Paris, their minds brimming with ideas, now found themselves shackled by the very addiction they had welcomed so enthusiastically. They had danced through the nights, writing, painting, and performing with a fervor that only came with the rush of heroin. But as the drug took over, the magic faded. What had once been the key to their creativity became the force that slowly but surely drained them of everything that had made them who they were. The highs, once so exhilarating, turned into nothing but fleeting memories, and the lows, once easily ignored, now crept into every waking moment. For the intellectuals and artists, this was the cruelest part of all. The heroin, the thing they had relied on to fuel their genius, was now a heavy weight that bore down on them every single day. The mind, which had once been so sharp, was now clouded. Ideas came less often, and when they did, they seemed more forced, less inspired. Writers who had once filled notebooks with pages of brilliant prose now struggled to write a single line without feeling exhausted or empty. Artists who had once been able to see the world in vibrant colors now stared at a blank canvas, unable to bring themselves to create. The real tragedy, however, was not just in the art that was left unfinished, but in the lives that were left broken. Addiction had slowly crept into every corner of the artistic world, leaving its mark on even the most respected figures of the time. Some never recovered. The creative giants of the era, those who had once seemed invincible, were now grappling with the fallout of their dependency. Some retreated from the public eye, never to regain the momentum they had once had. Others spiraled into obscurity, their once bright careers extinguished by their inability to overcome their addiction. And some paid the ultimate price, their lives tragically cut short before they could experience any redemption. As the city of Paris watched its most beloved artists fall from grace, it began to reckon with the consequences of its wild, heady years. The very institutions that had once embraced the chaotic, liberated energy of the era now looked back with regret. The bohemian lifestyle, so synonymous with freedom and expression, now appeared tainted. The city's reputation for artistic innovation seemed somehow hollow, a product of the very addiction that had fueled it. It wasn't just the artists who were affected. The city as a whole felt the ripples of this cultural crash. Paris had been a place of dreams for so long, a city where anything seemed possible. But now, the dreams are turning to dust. The aftermath wasn't just about the loss of art or the loss of life. It was about the painful reality that an entire generation had chased something they could never truly control. Heroin, once seen as a companion to creativity, had shown its true face as a destroyer. Those who had once embraced it for the promise of artistic enlightenment were now left picking up the pieces of their shattered lives. And for the rest of Paris, the carefree days of the 20s seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a harsh new reality. As the city came to terms with the aftermath, the creative world began to shift. New generations of artists would rise, but they would do so with the knowledge that the high, no matter how intoxicating, couldn't last forever. The idea that art could be born out of self-destruction started to lose its appeal. The world was beginning to understand that creativity could come from other sources, not just the self-imposed torture of addiction. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris had been an era of brilliance, of chaos, and of excess. It had been a time when the line between genius and madness seemed almost non-existent. But in the end, the consequences of that line blurred too much, leaving a city full of artists, writers, and musicians who had to learn the hard way that the cost of living on the edge was too high. And as the sun rose on a new era for Paris, the wildest, most decadent period of the city's history seemed to have finally come to an end. As we drift away from the chaos of the 1920s Parisian scene, it's hard not to pause and reflect on the wild, brilliant, and ultimately tragic era that once defined the city. The highs, the lows, the dreams, and the disappointments, they were all tangled together, creating a tapestry of creativity and destruction that shaped a generation. But tonight, as you settle into your own warm bed, with your own clean sheets and a comfortable pillow, maybe take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. Because the truth is, the people of Paris during those years were resilient in ways we might never fully understand. They pushed boundaries, they created masterpieces, and they lived on their own terms, no matter the cost. But it's also clear that no one can escape the consequences of living too far on the edge. The artists, the writers, the intellectuals, they were all trying to find something greater than themselves, something that could carry them through the pain and the uncertainty of life. And, in a way, they did. But in the end, they also paid a steep price. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in, surrounded by modern comforts like hot showers, heating, and maybe even a bit of silence, take a moment to whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors. They survived much harder things, like untreated diseases, harsh winters, and soups that probably didn't look as appetizing as we like to think. They made it through, and so can you. The journey, much like the one in Paris during those wild years, isn't always smooth, but it's filled with moments of brilliance, resilience, and occasionally a little chaos. And somehow, that's what makes it all worthwhile. Remember, history is strange, sometimes terrifying, but also deeply human. The people who lived through it were stubborn, hopeful, and maybe a little ridiculous in the best possible way. Just like you and me. Now, let the warmth of your bed and the comfort of this moment remind you that while we don't have to survive Paris in the 1920s, we're all part of the same endless cycle of creativity, discovery, and, hopefully, finding balance. Sweet dreams, good night.